every year, like you, I go back and I reread the stories of Easter. And I like to go back and I like to do a careful enough read to not take things for granted. I want to always be open and sensitive, like I know you are too, as to what God is saying to me and to you at this season of your life. And if you're like me, as you read these scriptures, you begin to say, Lord, what is it that you're teaching me today? What is it that you're teaching me? And as I was reading these stories, coming through this series that we just finished, up until this point now in the life of Peter, I began to read the encounter in John's gospel between Peter and Jesus after the resurrection. And I began to see and to understand at a greater level for myself the depth of the love that the Lord has for his disciple. But more importantly, the exchange of the relationship that was happening between these two over a modified breakfast that was cooked upon the shoreline there upon the sea. But before I go there, I think it's important for us to understand what got us to that point. Peter, if we'll recall, was the one who said that he would be strong, that he would be the one that would defend Jesus to the very end. In fact, the Gospels record that as Jesus walked along the sea, he began to call different men and women to be a part of his ministry, to be disciples. And Peter, or Simon, who is the son of John, as Jesus first met him, called him Simon, son of John, by his name, and looked at him and saw something specific inside of the heart of this man and said, I'm going to rename you. And he renamed him Petros, which in Greek means Peter, and it translates into the word rock. And rocks are foundational. Rocks are strong. And what Jesus was saying to Peter was, in you I find the strength that when all of this is said and done and it's time for me to go, upon you the rock, upon your faith, upon your strength, upon all of who you are, I'm going to build a church. And we see that this significant relationship was coming into being. We also learn through the Gospels that Peter's life was filled with so many ups and downs, that Peter had some great things happening. After boasting he would never abandon Jesus, that he would die before he would do that, we see in the Gospels that Peter is looking at a distance as Jesus is falsely accused, as he is falsely arrested, as he is brought before false charges and condemned to die. Peter sees Jesus, but Peter does not want to be seen with Jesus. And we begin to see a relationship that begins to have challenges. And we begin to see the reality of what this is in the life of Peter and Jesus. Some will say, well, he denied him. He betrayed him because he wouldn't speak up. And I guess for me, that it really raises a powerful question for all of us today is, have you, have I ever let anyone down? Is there someone that we've let down in our life? Maybe it was a boss, maybe it was a coworker, maybe it was a spouse or a sibling or a neighbor. But who is it that you have let down in your life? Who is it that your life has been impacted because you let them down? John writes that when Peter discovers that he has denied the Lord the third time, that he weeps uncontrollably and he flees from the area and realizes he is a bona fide failure. But 3 days later, we celebrated this last Sunday, a woman comes to the tomb and she sees something far different. And she runs back and she says, Peter and John, the Lord, I have seen him. This is what he said. Come and see for yourself. And as we know that John is the first to reach the tomb, it is Peter who physically goes into the tomb and sees that something spectacular has happened. At this point now we're back at the seashore and we're back at that time when all of a sudden they're beginning to fish and some other things are happening here. I begin to wonder that as Peter looks inside that tomb and physically goes in and picks up those grave clothes, I have to wonder, was Peter beginning to feel differently on the inside? Was there something about that? Could the excitement of Jesus' resurrection, could that replace his denial, his shattered faith? I imagine that Peter was glad that Jesus was alive, but I also know that in those tense moments when our relationships get a little funny, especially when we let someone down and we see them again, it begins not feels very good, does it? It becomes a little awkward. And I wondered, was he thinking that as he goes into that tomb? And the thoughts that go through my mind was Peter saying, do I still have a place in God's plan? Am I still a part of what the kingdom can be? Well, after Easter, John reveals to us this profound encounter, and this is where I want to spend our time today, out of John chapter 21. Afterward, this is after the resurrection, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas called Didymus, Nathanael from Cana of Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. I'm going out to fish, said Peter. We'll go with you. So they went out and they got into the boat, but that night they caught what? Nothing. And early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not recognize that it was Jesus. And he called out to them, friends, haven't you any fish? No, they answered. And he said, throw out your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. And when they did, they were unable to haul in the net because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved, which is John, said to Peter, it is the Lord. And when they landed, they saw a fire burning of coals there with fish on it and some bread. And Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish that you have just caught. Simon Peter climbed aboard and dragged the net ashore, and it was full of large fish, 153, but even with so many that the net was not torn. And Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. And none of the disciples dared to ask him, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. And Jesus came, took the bread, gave it to them, and he did the same with the fish. Now, there's some powerful things happening in this pericope of Scripture. Notice, Peter has left the ministry. He has nothing more to do with being a minister of the gospel. He's gone back to fishing. He has left all of that which he had learned from Jesus alone. And he has gone back to that which he knows. And one begins to wonder, does Peter now feel like he has nothing to contribute to the kingdom? Sometimes when you've fallen, sometimes when things don't go well, isn't it usually a good practice to go back to something you know? To something of familiarity? Something that will help rebuild and rebond your courage when couples have marital challenges. Oftentimes, they will go back to the place of their honeymoon and begin to recalibrate and refigure out what was going on at that time of the joy and the happiness that was amongst them. And it is here that Peter is going to get a second chance from Jesus right here on the shoreline. Notice also the similarities between Peter's first calling that we learned through the other Gospels, as well as what we read here at the end of John's Gospel. At the beginning of the Gospels, Peter is called by the sea. At the beginning of the Gospels, we also understand that Peter is fishing, and in both occasions, in the beginning of his calling and at the end here in John's Gospel, he catches nothing. In both instances, it's Jesus who says where to fish, and in both instances, we understand that there is a miraculous catch that comes at the beginning as well as at the end. And it is John who recognizes that it's Jesus, but it is Peter who is the one who physically risks the safety of being in the boat, that gets out into the water and swims to the shoreline before anyone else. Peter got to the shoreline, and what does he find Jesus doing? Jesus is fixing breakfast. He offers bread. He offers fish. When else did Jesus offer bread and fish? The feeding of the 5,000. It is there that Jesus is bringing this metaphor, this picture before Peter and the others to say, I am reminding you of the significance of what it is that you are called to do. And you have a critical mission before you. Now let me bring this back for a second. This is a minor detail of significant value. We see that while on the shoreline, Jesus has started a fire. What kind of fire? A charcoal fire. John is the only writer of the Gospels that specifically gives us that detail, that it is a charcoal fire that Jesus prepares on the shoreline. We see it in John 21:9. It reports that a fire burning with coals with fish and some bread. Prior to that, John writes in chapter 18, he talks about how they had gathered around a charcoal fire to warm themselves on the night in which Jesus is betrayed, or denied, I should say, by Peter. The charcoal coals, the charcoal fire is of a significant value that the writer wants us to understand. And specifically, we learn that when Peter comes to the shore and he sees the charcoal fire, he now recalls what happened at the charcoal fire when he was there and he denied Jesus. Sometimes we commit acts that are so atrocious. Sometimes we commit acts that just are beyond what we can think, and we just zero them out of our minds. And it isn't until we see something that reminds us, and it brings us back to that place of importance. Here we also see some other significant things happening. That once Peter sees the coals, it reminds him of this significant atrocity, this significant thing that he has done. Now, if we're going to accept God's grace in the form of a second chance, we have to acknowledge the truth. We have to acknowledge the truth in our own condition. We have to face up to reality. You and I, in order to accept God's grace, need to daily take off the masks that hide the true person that we are. We wear masks that mask the way of our life. We pretend to be happy, and the mask is on with a smile, whereas inside we are dying. We pretend to be spiritual healthy. We wear the mask that tells the world that we are good with God, whereas inside we are spiritually dying. We pretend to have healthy relationships with everyone. We can get along with anybody. We love everybody, whereas inside relationships aren't working well with us at all. We wear masks. And we must find ourselves to be in that position to where we can call it with truth who and what we are. And that's what Peter has to do here. At the charcoal fire, Peter remembers his greatest failure in life. He had many. You and I have failures in life. Here's some of the ones that Peter had. He overslept one morning, missed the morning whistle, and was late and didn't get to go fishing with some friends. There was a time that he allowed his anger to volcano to erupt. He had it stuffed down so long that it erupted in a volcano that he took out a sword and he took the ear off of someone in a crowd. There was a time that he experienced a miracle by walking on water. And the failure came that because his faith was not where it needed to be, he began to sink and almost drowned. Peter now remembers there at this charcoal fire the failures that he has before Jesus, and those failures are piercing his heart. And John records that after denying Jesus the third time, that we begin to see the reality, the realness of this hurt that Peter had, because he leaves unbelievable in the sense of all the tears in which he is grieving. And he begins to wonder, is that which he's done irredeemable? Is it unforgivable? And Peter is in a struggle. When you know that you failed, when you know that you have failed someone else and you're in their presence, there's a different feeling, isn't there? When you are in the presence of the one that you have harmed, the one you have hurt, the one you have failed, it feels different. And Peter realized at that moment that he began to wonder, what is this relationship going to be like now? As he stands before Jesus on the shoreline. Silence comes between them, like a prisoner awaiting a verdict of a death sentence. Peter is waiting for some sense of contact from Jesus as to what this will all be. Peter was full of doubts concerning where he stood. He was unsure as to who he would be by his master. And I suspect that he probably had in his mind those thoughts of Jesus turning and looking at him and saying, Peter, of all the people, you deny me? And Peter held all of that in his heart. But what do we learn about Jesus here? We learn that Jesus did not take out the dagger and continue to pierce and cut his heart. Jesus looked at him. In fact, we know that upon the shoreline, as he looked out at all who had abandoned him that day, he called them what? Friend. When they had finished eating the breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these?" Jesus asked the question 3 times. But notice to whom he asked the question. He no longer uses the name Peter. He goes back to the name in which he first called the man, Simon, son of John. Do you love me more than all of these? If you've been a parent, or all of us have been children, obviously, remember in those moments in our lives when our parents were a little fed up with us? Maybe it didn't happen to you, it happened a lot to me. Maybe you didn't do what your parents asked, maybe you strayed along the path, and no longer did that playful nickname ever come in, Snookums or Princess or whatever they called you. Mine would have been the nickname Bobby. But boy, when those times came, it was no longer that playful. It was Robert Michael Martin. And I knew that I had done something wrong. How about you? Now get this for a second. Simon, son of John. Now the question. Is not that technique used by parents today? When we call our children by their formal names, what we're really saying to them is, I have something very important here, and I want your fullest attention. Are you with me this morning? As he says this, Peter has to listen as to what's happening. I want your full attention. You see, after the denial, the name Peter didn't cut it anymore. Rocks are foundational. They are structurally sound. They don't get pulverized. They remain. Peter found himself no longer dependable. And Peter was anything but dependable. Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these, was the question that Jesus asked as he was waving his hands. In essence, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than all of this, all of these things, all of these boats, all of these nets, all of these fishermen that you have? Are you willing to leave all that you know? Are you willing to stop cowering and going back to what you know and stepping forward and doing what I've trained you to do? I need you to come back into the ministry, Simon, son of John. Do you love me more than all of these things, and are you willing to give them up so that you can follow me? Jesus also at one time looks and says, in the same sense, Simon, do you love me more than all of these? And maybe Jesus was looking at the other disciples because remember, Peter was always looked upon as being the leader. It was Peter that usually spoke up on behalf of the disciples. It was Peter who made the Lord so many promises. Do you love me more than these other disciples? Are you of more value than they? Peter says, Lord, I love you. But the way in which he said it isn't what we might think. In Greek, the word love has a couple of different meanings or translations or words that mean love. In our vernacular, the English language, we use the word love for just about anything. I love that blue paint. I love those new glasses. I love that pizza pie. I love my husband or wife. I love my little dog. I love the Lord, you see. But in Greek, it's a little more specific. The word eros, which is where we get the word erotic from, is more of a lustful kind of love. A love of intimacy, but more of a lustful kind of thing. And it's one of those loves that we have to be careful with. There is the word phileo, which is a love that means more like, that I like something with endearment, that I really like that. And then there's what we call the agape love, which is a love that is beyond all things, a love that means that we surrender ourselves, that it's no longer us that we want to do or to be a part of, but that we want to surrender to everyone else, and we want to serve them, we want to give to them, we want to love them with the kind of love that God says we're to have for one another. So Peter and Jesus are having this exchange. Simon, son of John, do you love me? Jesus is saying, do you agape me? Do you love me with the unsurrendered or with a totally surrendered, totally forgiven, the total self-emptying kind of love? And Peter's response is, I phileo you. I like you, Jesus. You're special. And we began to see this kinds of conversation. And Jesus asked this question 3 times. Simon Peter, do you love me? Here's what it would look like if that conversation was there. Simon Peter, do you agape me? Do you love me? Agape. And Peter would say, Jesus, I phileo you. I like you. Simon Peter, do you love me? Agape me. Jesus, I phileo you. I like you. The 3rd time, Jesus says, Simon Peter, catch this, do you phileo me, like me? Lord, you know that I like you. Why do you keep asking? And this is significant in what we need to understand about the character of God. Maybe this is part of God's mystery. When we can't get to the place that maybe God wants us to be, is it just possible that God comes down to the place where we are and meets us there? And at this moment, Peter, as he's holding on to all of this remorse, maybe his struggle was, there's no way I can say I agape you because of what I've done. But let me start, Lord, at least at the middle level and say that I like you a lot. Let me at least do that. But here's what I love. Peter is honest in his relationship. He's not trying to be something that everybody thinks he ought to be. It's kind of messy. And Jesus asks him those questions with the others standing there. And Peter's like, I'm just not there yet. And that's what's called a healthy relationship. That's when the mask comes off. And that's when we can speak the truth. And when we find out where the other really is, it's not our job to condemn or to have consternation against them because they're not where we think they need to be. But we're to meet them where they are. And we're to walk with them. The absence of honesty is detrimental to any relationship. And all relationships have to be honest. And sometimes in our relationships, when we have challenges, one of the party may not know there's a problem. Here's a funny story. An aged farmer and his wife were leaning against the edge of their pig pen, and the woman wistfully recalled that next week was going to mark their 50th anniversary. This has nothing to do with the anniversaries we celebrated earlier. Let's have a party, Homer, she says. Let's kill a pig. And the farmer scratched his head and he said, gee, Ethel. He finally answered, I just don't see why the pig should take the blame for something that happened 50 years ago. Honesty about the strength of relationships is important. But the question before us this morning is, how often are you and I honest about our relational conditions? Ask a person how they're doing, and you're rarely going to get an honest answer. The woman who sits at home while her husband is busy at work, he works 15, 16 hours a day. He travels a lot. She's at home and she has a wonderful house. She has 3 children. Everyone should think that her life is perfect. But when he comes home, he barely ever talks to her. There's not a whole lot going on. And a friend asks, how's it going? Oh, fine. Just fine. We see another instance of that. A woman talks with his out-of-town friend, or a man talks to his out-of-town friend on the cell phone, and he's been passed over for a promotion, not once, not twice. It's the 3rd time that he's been passed over. And he's getting a little anxious because he's heard rumblings of the company downsizing, and his career has kind of stalled where it's at, and he fears a layoff is imminent. And when his friend asks, so Mike, how are things going at work? Mike responds, oh, fine, just fine. A believer arrives to church on Sunday morning just as the worship service starts. She enters the church. She feels that God is a million miles away, and she no longer has the urge to pray, and she no longer hungers for God's word. She is known for quite some time now that she has cancer. And she's beginning to feel that God has betrayed her. She's angry at those times of just thinking that maybe God should have done something about this. And it's crossed her mind time and time again that just maybe, that there really isn't a God after all. Yet on Sunday, when the pastor asks, "How are you doing today? How well is your soul?" her response is, "Fine, just fine." Let me ask you, how well is your soul this morning? How well is our soul? Is it just fine? The unique arrangement with Peter and Jesus was that the exchange became very real. If you've ever been in recovery or know anybody who has been in recovery, one of the first things they'll tell you is the first step is to acknowledge what? There's a problem. And once you acknowledge there's a problem, you can then begin to start to work toward a solution. When we acknowledge before God that things are not fine, Lord, things are not okay, there's some unfinished business, there's some mistakes that have to be dealt with. It's at that moment that I truly believe that when we're honest before the Lord, that the Lord looks at us and says, okay, now I can start helping you work on the condition of your soul. The church is not a place for pretty people. The church is a place for dirty, for hurting people who are in dire need of grace, forgiveness, restoration, and acceptance. And we come together as a church to help one another, to grow in our faith, to grow closer to God. But we have to admit we need help with that. Peter, do you agape me? No, Jesus. I phileo you. I'm not totally at that agape love, and I know in my heart, Lord, that I want to be. I want to be there, but I lack the desire. I still feel attached to doing wrong. I'm remorseful for what has happened. I can't get over it. I need your help, Lord. And when we do that, God says, I'm right with you. Let's make it happen. Shusaku Endo, who's a Christian novelist in Japan, he centered many of his novels upon the themes of betrayal. Endo says that the most powerful message of Jesus was his unquenchable love for, especially for, people who betrayed him. When Judas led a lynch mob into the garden, Shusaku said, Jesus addressed him as friend. When the other disciples deserted him, but still he loved them. When his nation had him executed, yet while stretched out naked in the posture of ultimate disgrace, he writes, Jesus roused himself for the cry, Father, forgive them. In his book, The Jesus I Never Knew, Philip Yancey says this, there is no more poignant contrast between two human destinies than that of Peter and that of Judas. Both assumed leadership within the group of disciples. Both saw and heard the wondrous things. Both went through the same dithery cycle of hope, death, and disillusionment. As the stakes increased, both denied their master. There, the similarity breaks off. Judas, remorseful, but apparently unrepentant, accepted the logical consequences of his deed and took his own life, and went down as the greatest traitor in human history. He died unwilling to receive what Jesus had come to offer him. Peter, humiliated, but still open to Jesus' message of grace and forgiveness, went on to lead a revival in Jerusalem and did not stop until he reached Rome. You see the difference? Let me end just with these 2 points. No matter how gross your past has been, Jesus stands not only ready to forgive, but to restore. He can restore you and he can fulfill you in his glory. Even if, like Peter, you're a bona fide failure, Jesus stands ready to restore you today. Secondly, if you're going to be restored, then you have to be honest about your spiritual condition. Some are not fine in the faith today, and it's okay that you're not. Some lack commitment to Christ and his church. So the first thing that those who are at that position must do is admit it. Admit that your relationship with Jesus is not where he wants it to be with you. And open yourself to allowing him to be Lord of your life. And lastly, recognize when you're honest with God, be prepared that God will be direct and honest with you. God's not a fool. There are times in my life when I come to God and I say, God, I'm just not feeling so close to you today. Then I have to be prepared to hear these words from the Lord. Well, I haven't heard from you in a while, Bob. I've been here all the time. Where have you been? Honesty. Peter denied Jesus 3 times. Jesus restored Peter all times. He restores us today. Glory be to God.